Hello! So today I'm going to be talking about the rise of professionalism in the English military, in both the Army and the Navy during around the 1600s. So why did the English Army professionalize, and what are some factors that caused it? So during the English Civil Wars, parliamentarians are kind of upset for how the war was going, so they formed the New Model Army, which would kind of become the basis for what the professional army in England would become. And this would be further expanded upon with Charles II when he returned to the throne during the Restoration. For the Navy, it was more so of an increasing need from growing threats. So there were growing more threats, such as the Spanish Armada and the Anglo-Dutch Wars, which really showed the state that the English Navy was in and what kind of reforms it needed. And a lot of these reforms are performed by a man by the name of Samuel Pepys, who served on the Navy Board and in the Admiralty for about 20-ish years between 1660 and 1680, 1690. And finally, the having a professional army and a professional navy just really helps with projecting your power across the world and securing your trade networks and your colonial presence across the world. And this was more of an after effect, but we see the beginnings of it during the 1600s and early 1800s and early 1700s. So the English Civil Wars and the New Model Army formed the backbone of what would become the first professional army in English history. And both sides initially recruited their soldiers the medieval way, in the sense that they would call upon their vassals, and their vassals would raise soldiers, and the king would also raise his soldiers, and the parliamentarians would also raise their soldiers. But there was no sort of hierarchy that allowed them, there was no predesigned ranks in the army, there was no predesigned weapons, stuff like that. Nothing was standardized. And Sir William Waller, who was a parliamentarian during the English Civil War, said, "An army compounded of these men will never go through with your service. Until you have an army merely your own, that you may command, it is in a manner impossible to do anything of importance." Basically saying that our army is terrible and we need to modernize it and make it an actual army if we even plan on ever winning this war. And that's what they did. And the first step that they did this about forming a new model army was they passed a self-denying ordinance which forbade members of parliament from serving as generals in the army, and vice versa. Generals couldn't serve in parliament. Along with the self-denying ordinance, the new model army was also established, which standardized drilling, standardized weapons, standardized ranks in the army, and it really showed as the new model army was able to swiftly beat all of its enemies during the English Civil Wars. And they even overthrew the government after the wars had ended. But after the Restoration, or after the Commonwealth had failed, and during the Restoration, the New Model Army was disbanded. But a lot of its ideas would be carried over in the form of what would be the next English professional army. Charles II was very much intrigued with increasing the strength of the army. Very much reasons because of this is because he spent a lot of time in France in exile, and France was an absolutist monarchy at this time. And even when he left France, he was still observing what they were doing and how Louis XIV was expanding his control over much of continental Europe with his very effective and strongly professionalized army. And that's what Charles II wanted to be. But many people in England were still skeptical of a standing army due to the New Model Army and of just how much chaos it seemed to cause in England at the time. The army was loyal to the king initially, but Charles II appointed a parliamentarian as the head of the army, so this pleased both sides, because there was a big debate in England at the time about if a professional army was established, who would it be loyal to? Would it be loyal to the king, or would it be loyal to Parliament? And this was kind of a nice compromise where the king, and this only applied to Charles II and James II, because William III would do something a little bit different. But Charles II and James II would appoint a parliamentarian as the head of the army, but the army was technically loyal to the king. Many people became much more comfortable with the army after the Mutiny Acts, and the Bill of Rights were signed in 1689 with William III. And the Bill of Rights stated that the raising and keeping of standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless it be with the consent of Parliament, is against law. And that's basically what the Mutiny Act was. It was an act that was read every single year, that was repassed every single year by Parliament to ensure that the army would not be disbanded. And that went on for until the mid-1800s. And this kind of helped a lot of people get over the fact that they were having a standing army. And the eventual wars in the late 1600s, the Anglo-Dutch Wars and the War of the Grand Alliance, War of Augsburg, whatever you're calling it, also helped reinforce the idea that the people of England, that they needed a standing army if they wanted to stand a chance against the growing powers of Europe, i.e. France. So, like I said before, there were a lot of growing threats in Europe at the time that seemed to threaten the island that was Great Britain. And the only way that the England would ever really be able to secure their island is if they had a strong navy. So we start to see the first signs of a standardized navy with the Tudors, specifically Henry VII and Henry VIII. Before that, many ships were just converted. Before and a little bit after the Tudors, the converted ships were just converted merchant ships for the most part, combined with the ships of their vassals and whatever ships that the king happened to have. But for the most part, ships were not designated warships, but they were ships that were used in the time of war. Henry VII went through massive changes, and he is the one who constructed the first dry dock in English history, and he also went through the construction of many warships. And this was continued by Henry VIII. And Henry VIII also went on establishing the Navy Board along with the Office of Admiralty, both of which helped with the everyday running and control of governing of the growing Navy. Both these administrations helped oversee the Navy's duties. Although the Admiralty and Navy Board existed somewhat in the past, Henry VIII formally established them and made them an actual part of the government. After Henry VIII, there wasn't much to do with the Navy. They still built them up, and they still continued to build warships, but there wasn't much of an emphasis. But during the invasion of the Spanish Armada, it really showed that England needed some sort of navy if it wanted to protect its island, and this was even further reinforced during the Anglo-Dutch Wars, where this much smaller nation of the Netherlands was able to put up a very strong fight against England. So a man by the name of Samuel Pepys entered into the Navy Board in 1660, and almost the following year, in 1661, him and William Penn helped establish the Naval Discipline Act, and this established everything from what soldiers were allowed to eat, when they could sleep, what kind of ammunition they could use, the punishments, how officers were trained, what you could do to your officer, what you could say to your officer. So many things were established in the Naval Discipline Act, and it really shows how much of an emphasis that they were trying to place on their Navy at this time. Along with that, they also passed the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts, there were a lot of Navigation Acts. This is the Navigation Act of 1689. The British wanted to encourage shipping and trading within their own nation. So only the English could trade with the English. They couldn't trade with Dutch traders, something like that. This was aimed at increasing their trade and increasing the support for English shipbuilding, because they would need more ships to protect their trade if they weren't going to be able to trade with the Dutch or the French or anything like that. Following that, the trade in colonial empire was pretty much built on the backbone of the military. So to protect trade, countries needed large amounts of ships and large navies. Without that, they wouldn't be able to protect themselves anywhere. They wouldn't be able to control their trade routes. They wouldn't be able to enforce their authority. So England, was thinking ahead during the 1700s, and they went about establishing small trading ports and cities across most of the globe, and they took strategically important places like Gibraltar or islands of the Mediterranean and islands in the Caribbean, which could be used as like ports for resupplying their navies, which would allow them to project their navies even farther and create these huge trade empires, which would eventually blossom into an actual colonial empire. And much of the emphasis up until the French and Indian War was placed on the Navy, but after the French and Indian War, the British really saw that they needed to keep a military presence in their colonies. And that's what they tried to do, and this caused a lot of disdain between them and the American colonists. But after the American Revolution, they definitely knew that they needed to keep a military presence in their colonies, and that's what they did. And they didn't really have any other colonies like the Americans for most of their time, and anything as autonomous or free or as rebellious as the American colonies, mostly because they kept their colonies nice and autonomous and secured with their own troops. So in conclusion, the New Model Army and Charles II provided the base for what would eventually become the English Army. They standardized drilling and weapons and ranks and stuff like that. Now there wasn't as much of an emphasis placed on the Army as there was on the Navy, but they still went through some heavy reforms that really showed how far they had come since the medieval times. The Tudors provided the base for creating the Navy, and Samuel Pepys eventually was really the man who went through the eventual reforms that created what the Navy was. Like I said, with the Naval Discipline Act, which outlined everything that anyone in the Navy could be, what they needed to be taught, what they needed to know how to do, where they could be stationed, and stuff like that. This large Navy was necessary for much the same reason as the Army was, which was to protect colonial possessions, partake in European affairs, protect their island, except this was even more so because England was an island, and having a large Navy meant that you could project your power not just in Europe, but anywhere in the world. So those are the reasons why professionalism happened, and those are some of the factors that allowed the professionalism to actually happen in England, and it would only continue to grow more and more up into the 1700s, 1800s, and early 1900s. Thank you.